even though I'm not quite sure I'm getting in this moment precisely what that song has to do with alleviating or overcoming fear, I do know that it elicits a strong sense of power and courage and willingness and all of those strong spiritual qualities, of course, all of which are useful in neutralizing fear. So we'll see what else comes during the talk, but if not, that's enough, I would think. What an uplifting and just extraordinary song to listen to, really, and to allow ourselves to feel. One of the things that I realized as I was reading some of what Master and Swamiji wrote about fear is just how extraordinarily incapacitating it is. I mean, I would say that that's not a word that they used, but how undermining to every spiritual goal that we could have fear can be when we, I want to say, allow it to get the best of us, but fear is insidious and yet it has its own power, and it has a way of doing that. It kind of grows within. I'm sure many of you have noticed that you start to feel afraid of something, and in these instances, almost always we're talking about what a fear of failure, which is, I think, what this talk is specifically about, this secret. I'll have to go back and look at it. Yeah, fear of failure. I mean, just covers so much in our lives, but, and I mean, we could speak about that in many ways, how often we get fearful because we think we've done something wrong, or we're making a fool of ourselves, or we're pretty sure that we're being judged. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's less obvious, but how often, I think this is something else, what I'm about to say. I just interrupted myself, but I feel this about so many of the emotions that we've now been speaking about for a year, because this is our next to the last emotion. The last one is probably not to be missed, but it's the secret of overcoming the fear of death. And we can probably, I didn't read it yet, but I can pretty much imagine where Swamiji will go with it. But all of these feelings just have such power over us. Even those of us who are so wanting to be so conscious, putting out great energy and effort to be conscious of all of our movements, all of our behaviors, where our mind goes all the time. We're really not just doing our best, but we're doing better than most do about it. And yet, they get us. These feelings get us more often than probably most of us are happy about. And fear is like that. It just creeps up on us. And how often we ask ourselves, I found myself doing it today as I would just glance through a couple of pieces that Swamiji wrote about it, just how much more pervasive it is in our lives than we might know were we not focusing on it. Let me read what Swamiji wrote about it. He said, this is a wonderful line. It's like he writes this, and then I thought to myself, yeah, go try and live it, which is, of course, what we're trying to do, but it's challenging. The secret of overcoming the fear of failure is not to be attached to success. That's tricky, and we'll hopefully talk a little more about this as I move on, but success is so ingrained in us, not just in a worldly way, certainly in a worldly way. It's precisely what we're rewarded for in every way from the time we're the tiniest little babes. I mean, you take building blocks and you get the triangle and the triangle, and your parents are applauding you like you just got gold at the Olympics. I mean, it's huge. And everything we do when we get it right in somebody else's eyes, it just starts literally from the first moments of our lives, and it goes on to many more significant and totally understandable. You do a good job of teaching something to students. You do a good job if you're a doctor, you get the right diagnosis. All of the ways for everybody everywhere. It could just go on and on. How could we be so rewarded for success? Always have success be the goal. And even in some of the ways that we probably wish it weren't, like just putting on a good performance, having people think a lot of us, think well of us, but even egoically think a lot of us, gee, you sang that song so beautifully. Wow, that was a great talk. This course has been fabulous. You just painted my walls so perfectly, whatever it is. Very hard not to get, we are caught up in it, but to extricate ourselves from it, I would say more. So Swamiji says, the secret of overcoming the fear of failure is not to be attached to success. Then he says, concentrate on willpower and energy, which brings success. And it's very profound what he's saying here. He's saying, don't look at what we might call success, but rather those spiritual qualities that go into leading us to what the world might call success. At some point, Swamiji tells, every time I interrupt the reading, I have to go back and start from the beginning to give you the flow, but that's okay. An extraordinary story. Let me just see if I can find it, because if I can't in a moment, I'll just summarize it. He says he was reading a book by a woman, Joan Grant. I don't know who Joan Grant is, but in her book, it says that she remembered a past incarnation in which she had been in a bullfight on Crete. So she was in Greece, and she's in a bullfight. This was a true, according to her, past incarnation. And said she later realized that she'd been born into that life only to develop the courage to be able to face that bull. And that was an incredible realization, because whether she was killed or not wasn't the point. So what most people would call success in that instance would be living through the bullfight. Most of us would call that success. But the point that Swamiji was making is that the fact that she was willing to get into the ring, or whatever they call that, where you fight bulls, to go and find the courage to fight the bull was why she was born. That was the purpose of her whole life, was developing that courage. So this is what Swamiji means. He could have just as easily said courage here, but when he says concentrate on willpower and energy, which brings success, in this case it was courage. So it's not all of the ways that we're taught about worldly success, but again, the spiritual qualities behind it, that if we focus on those, rather than not being concerned about whether we succeed in the eyes of the world or not, then it is a success. Even your failures then, he writes, will become stepping stones to ever greater achievements. And that is, that again is just a very powerful statement. And I think something that each of us could apply really over and over in our daily lives, that it's interesting, I've mentioned this before, one of the first time I ever went into a Christian bookstore, which, as I've told many of you, frightened me because I was so afraid of Christ at the time, because I'd been born and raised Jewish. So interesting to look back and think, wow, that was just in this very same life. It's unbelievable what we can go through in a life. But it was true. I was afraid in there, and I was young. I was 13 because I was buying some Christian friend, I guess, something for a confirmation or something. I don't remember even what it was called, but I must have been very young. And I saw a sign which I owned until very recently. Somehow now it's disappeared from my life. But it said, the difference between a stumbling block and a stepping stone is how we use it. And it struck me, even as a young child, the truth of that. So many things come to us in life all the time. It's not what comes, it's what we do with it. And of course, Yogananda's told us that over and over. Every situation is neutral. It comes up against with this whole concept of fear, because everything that comes to us is neutral. All that matters is how we react to it or how we respond to it. So whatever happens to us in this life, Swamiji's saying in the last line of this, he says, even your failures then, outward failures, become stepping stones to ever greater achievements. It's a very powerful lesson in just a couple of little lines here from Swamiji, where he's saying to us, forget what the world thinks. Forget, in a way, everything that we've been taught. We are not concerned with how the ego feels. We aren't concerned with the way the ego gets frightened or hurt a little bit or reactive. In fact, the only reason we're concerned is because we want to expand beyond it. What we're concerned about is our soul's growth. And that's how we have to look at everything. And when we think about our soul and what the soul needs, it becomes much easier to understand Swamiji's teaching. And when he says here, don't worry about, is to not be attached to success. There's a great line from the Gita, from the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna says, "O Arjuna, remaining immersed in yoga or union with the spirit through meditation," this is the translation, "perform all actions forsaking attachment to their fruits." In other words, he's describing here Nishkam Karma. Do what we need to do and don't think so much about what we'll get back from it. But then Krishna says, remain indifferent to success and failure. Because, of course, we know whether we're focused on really wanting to succeed or we're afraid of failure doesn't really matter. It's just different sides of the same coin. That coin is the ego, of course. And he says, so he's saying, forsake attachment to their fruits, remain indifferent while performing all actions. So Krishna is saying to Arjuna, no matter what you're doing, don't do it with any concern about success or failure. Do it the best you can do it without thinking about what's going to come back your way because of it. And then he says, and this is interesting, I've never read this, it just sounds so simple, but it caught me today. The mental evenness during all states of activities, and parenthetically, they say, resulting in success or failure, is termed yoga. And it's just so right. It's such a simple way, but a perfect way of saying it, where he's saying, What we call yoga means that evenness of mind, that being willing to let go of the fear of failure or the exuberance that we feel when we succeed. Fear is a very interesting emotion because it has more than almost any other emotion that we've talked about all year, a very powerful magnetic quality to it. This doesn't help us resolve our attachment to it, I would almost say, but it's true. And when we start paying attention in life, I would have thought of this as part of the psychological quality of fear. But the truth is, it has a very spiritual, energetic, at least explanation, but it's more than that. It's a truth. It's the reality of it. Fear has a strong magnetic quality to it. So very often in life, we draw to ourselves exactly those things that we're most afraid of. And if one watches, and just because I've been at all the different posts that I've been put at in this life, I've seen it so often, just being in the position to listen and listen and listen to people, that the very thing that they're most afraid of happens, and then we get to say, see, like, I told you I shouldn't do this. I knew this was going to happen. But it's not that you knew it was going to happen. It's that you actually created it, which is way more powerful than even knowing that it might happen. Of course, things could happen. I mean, anything could happen at any moment, but not to live in fear of them actually makes them a lot less likely. This image just came to mind right now. I don't have a really good sense of balance. I just never have. It's not that I fall a lot, though I must admit I fall a little more these days than I did up until a few years ago. I think that's pretty common with aging. But I've never been somebody who's fallen a lot. But I've always been afraid that I'm going to fall. Now, I mean, I don't mean I walk around in the world afraid I'm going to fall. I mean being up at 10,000 feet in the Himalayas, crossing a little rope bridge, you know? And I mean this really because, you know, those Sherpas, they just like grab your bags and they go across these bridges. And I'm watching them like, nope, no way. I am not stepping foot on that bridge. Believe me, I've been carried across a few of them. Just because of my fear, what I've seen, or even balancing on a log crossing a river, I am much more likely to fall. And I've watched it happen. And the times where I've just sat still and collected myself and found that courage and calmed myself, I can walk across the log. Or I can't say I can just walk across one of those bridges because I was filled with fear every time I did it. But when you feel that fear, and you can feel it in a physical way, you get tense, you lose that just ability to flow, and which is part of what balance is. You start going a little bit this way, you correct, but you don't want to overcorrect. And really, when you think of it, it's exactly the same way that we deal with fear in our lives all the time. We deal with fear by getting rigid and by overcorrecting. And so, again, we make that thing happen. We draw it to us. We manifest it, literally. So Swamiji's saying here, quit thinking about whether you're going to succeed or fail, and much more bring to every moment of your lives, as much as you can, what Krishna's talking about here. Let go of it and just decide to be in each moment and do it the best you can. Now, of course, I'm aware as I'm speaking that there are those, what would I call them? They're more than neurotic fears, because all fears are neurotic, but those fears that, trying to think of the diagnostic term for them, but I can't, which I think is a good sign. More and more medicine's leaving my mind, and it's perfect. But those fears where you just can't overcome them, they have you, they're irrational, and you just can't get beyond them. And I want to say what I've said. I remember saying it very often at the beginning of the year when we were talking about, I don't know, more common emotions, anxiety, depression, anger, things that people would feel all the time. And I wanted everybody who is listening to know that I felt exquisitely sensitive to what it must be to experience depression. As somebody who really hasn't, but who's seen it a lot, I respect how hard it is to lift oneself up out of it. So I'm saying the same thing about fear. Can anybody think of the word that I'm trying to think of? It's a common word, darn it. I hope it. No, they are debilitating, but anyway, let me not get too sidetracked here. It'll come to me or not. There's actually a diagnostic term for a fear that you just can't. It is an irrational fear. Okay, I'm going to let it go. All of these adjectives are, yes, they're accurate, but there's a different word that I'm looking for. It doesn't matter. So for people who deal with some of those kind of fears that literally drive their life, some of the... Phobia, thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Yes, phobias. I don't know if Lakshmi just came to her. She quickly looked it up as a... I'll never know, she says to it. She's right. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah, people who deal with phobias, that's actually that's a medical condition. And I'm not referring to that, though it will follow the same spiritual guidelines, but may actually need to be treated medically first before one can even bring to bear these spiritual approaches that we're talking about here. But for most other fears, to begin to look at them and say, you know, what am I going to do with this? Master is very interesting when he talks about the what to do about it, because it's one thing to understand it, to see how it gets us, how he calls it at some point a poisonous magnet. That's Master's term for fear, again, because we draw the things to us that we're most afraid of. But what he says when he talks about what to do about it, he says, if you are feeling really frightened, he said, pick up a very light-hearted book. Literally, these are Yogananda's words, not mine. But a very light book, and start reading a book. He says, do whatever you need to do to take your mind off of the fear, to not give it energy. He said, watch a movie, again, not one of these scary movies, of course, but a movie, a lighthearted, fun, or uplifting movie. I mean, at other points, he says, yell at the fear. You can just imagine Yogananda getting all of his energy. But he says to us, sidetrack your mind. Literally, take your mind somewhere else, because there's no other way to get around the fear than to do that, than to put your mind somewhere else. In other words, this is an interesting turnaround. If you start fighting with the fear, you've lost the battle. If you go straight on to do battle with it, because, you know, he's told us over and over, you can't solve a problem at the level it was created. So you cannot use the mind to fight this feeling. You have to be able to transcend it by putting down any concern about whether you succeed or fail. I remember, I've learned this from Swamiji. I should say I'm learning it, if the truth be told. But you remember the story where Swamiji was asked at the last minute to go and stand in for Yogananda. I think he had gone down to the Hollywood Church. Yogananda, if I don't have the places right, I think pretty sure I do though. And Yogananda hadn't been down there for some months, so everybody was waiting for him. And then at the last minute, he told Swamiji to go. And I remember Swamiji saying, he said, you know, I wasn't really afraid. He said, in fact, I felt sorry for those people. There they were waiting for Yogananda, and they were going to get this 23-year-old kid. But then he went on to talk about what is the worst that could happen, that he would say things that were foolish. He said, you know, I almost expected it of myself, that they wouldn't like the talk. And he sort of, in whatever words he used, you know, he was in a way being lighthearted about himself, but telling truths. And he would say, that wouldn't have surprised me. He went on to talk about it a bit. And it was very helpful for me, because when we really want to please people, it becomes harder and harder to please people. When we're really taking ourselves that seriously, it becomes harder to do it. When we can get out of the way and know that we're doing our best, but what our best is doing the best we can do to attune ourselves to the masters, doing the best we can do to be open channels, doing the best we can do to remember that it's always them acting through us. Much more likely that it's going to be a pleasant or fun or whatever we're looking for in that moment experience for everybody. But then we ask ourselves, and I've employed this now many times, and this is both Swamiji and Master saying, ask yourselves in as many situations as you can, what is the worst that could happen? What is the worst that could happen? So, I mean, if you happen to be walking across a rope bridge at 10,000 feet and you fall, well, the worst that could happen is you die. Now, we'll have to wait till next week when we talk about the fear of death till we get to how do we get beyond that. It's scary. I don't think there's any way, well, no, that's probably not true. But for this soul in this body, no way was I going to walk across that bridge and just say, hey, if I die, I die. I mean, it's one thing if you think you're dying for your guru. Maybe I could find the courage to just stand up there and run the risk of falling. But on a backpacking trip, I don't think so. I did not want to go down into that, I mean, much more than a crevasse. I mean, it was far. Let me just go back to where I just lost. I got so into my fear of that is what I got into, but those images of that I got lost that I want to say. But as much as possible, if we can say to ourselves, really, if I speak seriously, even in certain instances where we would be willing to sacrifice our life for something, if the worst case scenario is that we might die, that's probably not always a very responsible in this life thing to do. But when we're talking about giving a talk or singing a song or dealing with our children in most of the moments the way we deal with them, or being in a discussion with people that matter to you, all of those ways that you want to do a good job, painting a picture that you've been working on. I mean, just, again, it just goes on and on. Many times when I've been able to say to myself, Shanti, what is the worst thing that could happen here? And many times, as I was saying to you last week, it would come to me. And again, this is more years ago than now, but where I'd be getting up to give a Sunday sermon, which always felt, it feels like a sizable responsibility in a way. Not my responsibility, theirs, but hard to remember that at times. You know, very different than some of the other places. I'm just saying I because I'm trying to, I know it's easier to hear these things if they're not about you. If they're about me, it's much easier to hear. So this is why I would share my experiences. But I learned that before I would come out here on a Sunday to say to myself, what's the worst thing that could happen? It's like what Swamiji said, you don't give a good talk, people leave feeling like, oh, that was okay. You probably aren't going to make a huge fool of yourself, but even if you do, the worst case scenario, you make a huge fool of yourself. And the more we do that, which is something that, as I said, both Master and Swamiji suggest, the more that we ask ourselves that, very often we start seeing that those things that we're afraid of so many times in life, asking somebody out on a date, making a dinner party, and you're not sure if the food's going to turn out. We think they're silly, but they make up a life. They actually start making up a whole life of all of the times that we felt insecure. And when we can say to ourselves, so what if we make a dinner that doesn't taste great? So what? Then we can say to ourselves, what if I give a talk that isn't the best talk? Or you just fill in your own blank. Most of the time, the anticipation with fear is far greater than the realization that what we're afraid will happen is not exactly what's going to happen, or the consequences aren't that great. And that's a very, it sounds so simple, but as I said, Master repeats it in his teachings. Ask yourself that question and then move forward. Let go of any thought that you have of what the outcome is supposed to be. I would be hard-pressed to share the number of times in my life where I was pretty convinced that something, a counseling session, an evening with a friend, a talk, a class, a run, I mean, even running when I used to race, sure all along that my time was going to be terrible. Whatever it is, how many times I was convinced because my ego was in there. You did a bad job. This is terrible. This didn't meet anybody's expectations. And then that evening, the next day, whenever, people just say, wow, that was so meaningful to me. Or, wow, when you said whatever it is, and then I say to myself, you didn't know what you were supposed to say here. Master knew. Master would have you stand up and give a terrible talk if one person was going to get one thing that was good for their soul. That's what would happen. If Master had his eye on that one soul and wanted to help them, it wouldn't matter if the other 100 people sitting here said, well, that was okay, but not great. One person was helped. We just don't know. We can't know from where we are what the soul is trying to do, except to overcome the hold that the ego has on us. And the ego actually loves it when we're afraid. Let me just look and see before I stop for questions. Yeah, really, in most ways, I've just said what I think is important. We're talking about non-attachment is what we're talking about. It's not easy, but it's nonetheless the only way through this, to quit thinking that we care so much about what people think about us. And that turns out to be the bottom line. I mean, as Swamiji said so beautifully here, lost the reading. Just wanted to repeat it, though. Yeah. Not to be attached to success. Concentrate on the spiritual qualities behind it. Even your failures then become stepping stones. Here's another thing that Swamiji and Master said, and that is, if you feel like you're failing at something, and if you can turn it around and use it as the incentive to do better, then the exact outcome of that experience is far less meaningful than the spiritual progress that you've made trying to do that very thing, whatever it is, better next time. One of the points that I forgot to make that I want to share is, because Swamiji says it so often, in the few articles that I read that he wrote about, not fear of failure so much, but fear, is that most of the things that we're afraid of, we bring in from past lives. That would seem obvious once I say it, but in the moment it feels so immediate. It feels so here and now. But we're coming in with all of these fears kind of nestled in our chakras, in vrittis. We come in with them, and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of willingness to stumble, to maybe fall, to maybe give the talk that we feel like we made a fool out of ourselves. Whatever it is that we're afraid of, for each person it's going to be different. But to work at it, to come to it with self-honesty and courage are the two words that come to mind to just consolidate what they've said, so that we don't continue to carry that karma on with us. So they both say, and this also caught my attention, it took me a little by surprise, there's nothing other than the instincts of a baby, those instincts, the fear of falling and that fear of loud noises. We've seen infants or little animals all have those. Otherwise, the fears that we have are mostly from past lives. We've come in there imprinted. And so it's not like we can justify them. This is where psychology fails us, though I always feel that psychology can help, but it's never the end point. We have to then lift everything up by a spiritual thread in order to heal, in order to really succeed for the soul. It's got to end on the high note of the spiritual understanding of it. And I think that's what they're saying here. This is imprinted in your astral spine, energetically there, every fear that we have. So the more we can stand up and face it and be determined to not let the fear win, then we are dissipating more and more and more karma. Now, of course, we're going to pick up a few fears as we go in this lifetime, too, because that's the nature of the human condition until we're Jivan Muktas. But it's okay. We're going to wind up neutralizing more than we lay down. So I think in a way that allowed me today to think of this as how could we be more objective with regard to our fears, so we step out of the emotion of it, which we think we want to do, but even if we employ our minds for a moment, which is what Master's telling us to do, read a book, watch a movie, ask yourself what's the worst thing that could happen, and I would add to it now, remind yourself, there's nothing going on to be afraid of. You came in with that. You don't want to just keep giving into it. You want to really say, I can be done with that. I don't have to be afraid. Remember, I'll tell you this and then I'll end. I've spoken about this many times, so I bet at least many of you have heard it. When I went out for dinner with Swamiji once, and he was sitting right across from me, and I don't remember the conversation or how we got here, but he looked at me and he said to me, I think at that point he was saying that he had never been nervous in his life. He had never been nervous about anything. I would bet, and from every story that I've read, like when somebody was dangling him out of the dormitory window when he was in college, when bullies were always beating him up. I mean, so many stories. Swamiji always says, I wasn't afraid. Remember somebody said to him, why didn't you call for help? He said, because I wasn't afraid. He sat there and he said it to me, and I thought, oh my God. I must have been, he said, I've never been afraid, because I remember I said to myself, I've been afraid of everything in my life, which I think in a way I've been afraid of a lot. It's just somehow I came in with the energy to do it anyway. People say you're so courageous. No, I don't think so. Unless we call courage being afraid but doing it anyway, then I would call myself courageous. So I've been afraid of most things I've done in my life, but I've just gone ahead and done them. But Swamiji could say he's never been afraid. Well, then it really, right in this moment, I'm thinking to myself, you too could do that, not just me, but all of us, if we hold it a little more objectively and we say, what is this fear? It holds no reality of its own, none. There's no reality in fear. Situations are always neutral. It's simply how we react to them. Most other people in the world would not be afraid of the thing you're afraid of. They just wouldn't. They'd be afraid of what they're afraid of. But it speaks right to the point. Karma, of course, is so individual, and it's ours to overcome. So if we remind ourselves, you do not need to be afraid here. The worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to stand up and not give a good talk. The worst thing that might happen is you get a C on an exam. The worst thing that might happen is you sing a song and you didn't hit the high notes. It's just, it doesn't matter what it is. I'm talking about performing, but it's not just performing. It's asking somebody out on a date and being told no. Like, so what? I mean, really, so what? So I think this is the way we need to look at fear. It's not current events for us. It's history. It has nothing to do with us. We could turn it around, look at it differently, quit caring what everybody else thinks, tune in, see where we need to be, and move forward and live our lives with that courage, with that self-assurance, with that strength, with all of our spiritual power intact, rather than allowing it to be undermined, weakened by the emotion of fear in this instance. So let me stop there.